some might say I'm a Luddite, and I might agree with that. Sometimes there's nothing you want to do more than get out into nature, disconnect from the whole world, sit down, and just listen to a podcast. Those sometimes are the best of days. Welcome back to Switch to Linux. And today, what we want to do is talk a little bit about podcasting without being perpetually connected to the internet. Many people these days want to have some degree of separation, and it's becoming more and more popular as smartphones and technology and the perpetual connected culture is always just linking us together. At times, we just want to separate out. We want to get away from the always connected. We want to get away from the smartphones, as I just helped a friend of mine migrate away from his smartphone to a flip phone. And we want to slow down a little bit more. And as he asked me about how we can best do this, I thought back to the good old days. Am I really a Luddite? Probably not in the most technical definition. Neo-Luddite, I think we're starting to see a movement. If you're unaware of this, the Luddite movement happened around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And these were the people that were concerned that all of the automation is going to take over their jobs. And we're seeing, in fact, a neo-Luddite operation now with AI and now at risk of taking over a lot of our jobs. And so what the Luddites did is they would go in and sabotage the equipment. Now, I do not believe in that, and I believe that technology in and of itself carries some really good elements, but oftentimes it brings us way too into the computer and the tech and the perpetually connected world and doesn't get us out into the world enough. And so we want to talk today about how you can utilize podcasts without being perpetually connected, because podcasting is something that is growing. Of course, Spotify has been doing a lot of investment in podcasting world. iTunes has always done it, and things like that. So as I started thinking about this, I thought back to the good old days. Now, way back before I was really into privacy and security, believe it or not, I was actually a top 10 geocacher in the state that I lived in. I was, I think, ranked number 6. Now, this is before geocaching was absolutely mainstream, before you could find a geocache every 500 feet inside of a city, before microcaches were a huge thing. A geocache at that time was usually off the beaten path. It would take you a while to get to it and things like that. But if you can imagine me on an internet-ready system actually logging my GPS coordinates and then know where we are now as a privacy advocacy channel. Completely different. Needless to say, I don't log into geocaching anymore. I've not updated it. I've kept the thing, occasionally just see what's going on in the world. But back in those days of geocaching, which predated smartphones, we had to have our separate camera. We had to have our separate, I had the cell phone to take with me in case of an emergency. I had the full GPS, and I had one of the geocaching ready GPSs. We could actually upload the geocache files, so I didn't have to manually enter the coordinates. I had to have the separate camera. So all of the equipment was separate. And there is a powerful conflict with minimalism, as of course I'm also in a way a minimalist in that I don't like excess stuff. I want just the tools that we need. So you'd think that a smartphone would be the one thing that we all say, because with minimalism, I can have one device that is the GPS and is the camera and is the podcast utility and is the MP3 player and does all of these things. The problem I have with a smartphone, it is also always online. Now, I am not addicted to my smartphone, but that is not a problem, or that is not a thing with a lot of people. Most people, whether you want to be or not, whether you recognize it or not, are severely addicted to the smartphones. And since my friend kicked his smartphone out of his house, in just a short period of time, he's already gotten through tons of reading, done a lot of self-reflection. He has reduced himself to nothing but one computer in the house that is only on occasionally when he needs something on the internet. So the thing is, though, is that when we become a neo-Luddite, we have to have a little bit more responsibility. And this is what I told him, is we have to learn to manage your files a little bit differently. You don't have a centralized app which does everything automatically. And that's really the direction we want to do, is we want to look back to those days. We want to get away from big tech. We want to get away from the smartphones and the ever-connected internet-ready world. Now, it's great that we can have Starlink, and as a van dweller, I could drive my van into somewhere nowhere near any cell towers and still get internet. I don't personally do that. I stick around the internet areas when I need to work. But the reality is we have an ever-connected world, and the ever-connected world is leading us to a massive increase of narcissism. So moving away from the ever-connected world and learning how to do things in those old days is generally a little bit better. And so here we want to talk about managing podcasts without relying on big tech. How can we manage podcasts without Apple or Spotify or Google or Amazon or all these other places requiring an app and a login so that you have one central perfect app that manages it all and you don't have to think about it, but they're really collecting a lot of data, and then they're using this because, they're not pushing out these podcasts for completely free. They want to get something for it in the background, and if they get nothing more than the data and the information you're using, this is still valuable things to their marketing assets. And we want to talk about avoiding those. The first thing we want to do here as we move through our goals, we want to figure out where your podcasts are. You want a list of them. You want either their names, maybe some direct feeds. You want to know where they're pushing their podcasts to. Things like my Christian podcast, I publish the feed directly on the website. So any way you have, and if you're just old school and you want to take that feed and throw it in a web browser and download the file manually in RSS, great, you got that option. We do have our podcast on iTunes and Spotify and Google and Amazon, and most of these I didn't even have to request it gets there. You get it in one thing and your podcast gets automatically put somewhere else. So you don't have to worry about being locked out of podcasts. It's like the only thing in our world because they haven't figured out how to contain it. Once they figure out how to contain it, we're all kind of screwed. But what we want to do is figure out first and foremost, where is your podcast? If it's only on iTunes for some weird reason, that's fine. You still do not need an iOS device to access it. Okay, we'll talk about how to get that in a bit. But you want to sort out your podcast, find out where their feeds are. You want to figure out where you can get them. Now, you might be, hey, I use Spotify and this is where I want all my podcasts are there. That's fine. That's great. You will have to stick with that ever-connected world, though. I'm not sure if Spotify allows you to download or not. I really don't know. I don't use these services. You have to understand. You could ask, how do I do this on the... I don't know. I just don't use those services. Now, I did play around with a few podcasting tools. We'll get to those in a minute on an Android, which does allow actual offline functionality as well. Again, we'll get to that in a moment. But sort out your podcast, figure out where the lists are. Are they on iTunes? Do they have a direct feed? And the other thing is, see if you are currently consuming podcasts and you're saying, I really want to get off of them, does your current podcast tool allow you to export an OPML file? The OPML file is a listing of all the podcasts, so as long as you're migrating to some other podcasting tool that supports this type of file, it will automatically import everything that you have. So as we move into this, the one thing that we have to keep in mind is the free and open source software. It's not just about being free and open source. It's not about protecting your privacy exclusively. Most of your free and open source tools, particularly anything interacting with files and stuff like this, usually allows a privacy-focused offline model. And that's really the important part. So the first thing I did is, despite I don't actually consume podcasts on my Android, I decided to take my Lineage Android phone here, which I do not allow Google Play services. I don't even have micro G on this thing. I just have raw Lineage, some custom block files, and if it's not an app that's available through F-Droid, I don't install it, period. So I did go ahead and jump on over to F-Droid, and I did find that there are actually a number of different privacy-focused podcasting apps. Of course, all of them need access to the internet. They need to be able to write to your card, but you can look at F-Droid to see what other services are there. Some of them are better, some of them are worse. I looked at 3 of them specifically. And having a look at these 3 specifically, what I wanted to do is see how easy is it to find my podcasts, how easy it is to find my various episodes, how easy is it to use the thing. And what I found is there is the first one, which is called Pod Listen. So with the Pod Listen account, I could actually get in there, I could add subscriptions, and I could literally just search for anything that I was looking for. So here we'll go ahead and search for my podcast and just search the database and see what we can find. And I don't know if we'll find mine on this or not. Of course, mine is available. So I'm not seeing it here. This is probably the downside of this particular app, is it doesn't seem to do a pretty good job unless you do some searching. You can usually find stuff you need, but I did find it's a little bit limiting, and it does allow to import an OPML file, so if you already have it, but I did find that it was a little bit more difficult to find some of those individual podcasts. Next one I looked at, I didn't even know how to pronounce this. This is a really bad name for an app. It's TSACDROP, like TSAC drop, I guess. I don't know. Horrible name. Actually a pretty good app overall. So it allowed me, with just a simple search, I was able to find the podcasts, including mine. So it found my podcast pretty easy. And of course, I don't know how many people watch my Christian podcast or not, but or listen to it, I should say. But I actually did find it pretty easily utilizing the basic search tool here. I did search for a few other podcasts, and what I did find is that some of the podcasts showed up pretty easily, some of them did not. Overall, the app was pretty good in that it was able to sort out the particular podcast I was looking for, and I was able to see those inside of this. And then the UI is not too bad. You can click on one, and then I'd have to manually download it in order to play it. The last one I looked at is Escape Pod. And with Escape Pod, we actually had the ability to sort out the different podcasts, and I was actually able to find a number of different podcasts pretty easily. So of course I found mine. I found Grace to You. I found Glenn Beck was on there. So I just kind of searched for different things just to look at a couple different podcasts. And you can see it is doing a pretty good search. So I don't know how exactly it's working, what it's looking for. But looking up Matt Christensen here, you can see that the Matt and Blonde Show, Matt Christensen podcast. So we're actually seeing the podcast I'm expecting to find. So this actually does give me a lot of control. The UI looks pretty good, and you'd have to come over here and click on the download button. And it does warn you if you're not connected to Wi-Fi to download episodes and things like that. And then now this will, the downside of this is that I found is that it doesn't have a really easy UI to say, yeah, I want to listen to this particular episode or that particular episode. But, it works. It does a good job. And if you have the podcasts that you're looking for, you can do that. Now, this video is not actually about what you can do with the podcast apps on the phone as much, because we are talking about being neo-Luddites and getting out into nature and getting offline. Now, you are going to need an internet connection at some point in time in order to do the things you need to do. So this is where the Linux podcast apps come into play. Now, if you've not yet made the full switch to Linux, that's okay. There are other good offline podcasts for Windows and for Mac. You can look around for those, do a look online, but we are a Linux channel. So I'm going to, in the interest of shortening the video, which is already very long, I want to go ahead and just talk about how I might do this on Linux. And then some of the principles behind this are going to translate over into the other operating systems, just giving you some tips. On Linux, there are multiple different podcast apps available. Gpodder is one that is frequently used. I did find Gpodder works best if you have the direct link. If you're looking for something on like iTunes, it's going to have a much harder time finding it. Rhythmbox, as much as it's not my favorite media player on Linux, it manages podcasts beautifully, and the search feed will search through all of your major podcast providers. So if it is on iTunes, you are going to be able to link to it on Rhythmbox. And then you can specify where those podcasts are downloaded. If you want them downloaded directly into your music folder, you can go ahead and do that. or you can download those into some other custom folder on your system. There are a variety of Flatpak options out there as well. So whether you are using FlatHub or whether you're using your regular software center, I think there's a few Snap ones as well. So there are a variety of different podcast apps available for Linux. And the first thing you're going to want to do, though, as we move into the next section, is how to organize your files. So let's talk about that next. All right, so organizing your files is going to apply if you're listening to things on the computer, or maybe if you're trying to take a complete neo-Luddite approach and get offline, get yourself a little MP3 player that has no bells and whistles. You can download your episodes, put them into your MP3 player, and walk off. In that case, you're going to need to organize your files. Of course, if you're using your phone app, that's fine. You don't even need to organize anything. I don't even know how you'd organize things. I'm sure they're in there somewhere. Check the folders under the apps or under the documents. Who knows? I have no idea. Didn't even look into that. If you're using an app, you're probably just going to keep using your app. But if you're looking for an alternative option, if you want to convert yourself to neo-Ludditism and you want to engage in your podcasting with an offline MP3 player, you're going to need to organize your files. So organizing your files, like I said, in Rhythmbox and in gPodder, you can choose where those files are downloaded. When you go in on Rhythmbox, you're going to see the list of the podcast, you're going to see the list of available episodes, and then you're going to have to go in there and hit the download button so it doesn't download everything. So with those, you're going to want to know where they are. Usually the default is just dropping them into your music folder. You can't specify where it goes. Now, one of the things that I have found is that the podcasts don't always do a real good job at tagging the media files. Now, I do personally on my podcast are very well tagged, even though you still might want to change the tagging. You might want to drop them all into an album that says podcast. I don't know. Or artist, podcast, album, who knows. But you have that flexibility. What I use on Linux is the tool called Kid3. There are a few other audio taggers out there, and you can have a look at other reviews to talk about them. I use Kid3 because it has worked very well across every system that I'm using, whether I'm using a GNOME system or a Cinnamon or a Mate or an XFCE. I have found Kid3 works best for me in all cases. Kid3 allows you to open up a directory, view all the MP3s in there. It allows you to do batch file adjustments, so you can copy them all, change the artist, change the album. I can change the titles if they don't give you logical, reasonable titles. I can very easily copy everything in a tag 2 up to a tag 1. I can add or remove MP3 images if you want the images, or if you say, my MP3 player doesn't use them, I'm going to take the images off. You can go ahead and do that. Kid3 allows you to edit, correct, or organize the data that best suits your needs. So you're going to want to have a look at that, get your files all organized, and then once you have downloaded your files, you know where they're at, you've opened them up in Kid3 to make sure all the tags are going to match properly for what you need. Our next step is going to be moving your files to your device. So basically, most of your MP3 players that don't have the Wi-Fi bells and whistles, usually you're going to have some type of cable. You plug it in, and your computer sees that device as nothing more than just an external storage device. Open the thing up and look where it is. In my case, the SanDisk application that I have, I just open them up and I drop them. If I want to access them through the podcast menu, I drop them in the podcast folder. If I want to access them through the music menu, I put them in the music folder. Of course, I can also use the file system on my SanDisk player here, and I can find all of the files whichever way you're going to go. But moving your options, unless you have some automatic sync option, moving your options over onto the device manually is usually what I do. And then if I want to save any of them, I might just save them somewhere, or I might just delete them to make room for the new ones. The other application for this I haven't mentioned yet is my van has a USB port. And I can just drop a USB drive of files onto there, and then they will automatically appear in my system without having to connect to internets or phones or any of that other nonsense. So I can, of course, just plug those files into a USB port. You might check if you have a fairly modern car if that is an option, because it might be easier than fumbling with your Bluetooth. It's certainly more secure than connecting your phone to your car with your Bluetooth, which you should never do, by the way. The amount of data that cars collect and the fact that all that data is stored in there and most people don't know how to delete the car's memory once you're done, that is another issue that we have to keep in mind. But that being said, if you can simply plug a USB port into your car and listen to your podcast there, way simpler to manage. End of your day or end of the week, for what you might do, you just pull that USB drive out, take it inside, plug it into your computer, make whatever the adjustments you want, pop it right back in the car. Your car should automatically update. And the same will work for your MP3 player. So there is our basic toolkit on utilizing podcasts while being a nature-loving Luddite. You do not have to tie into online accounts. You don't actually have to have a constant internet connection to listen to podcasts. On Linux, it is easy to manage and to organize your episodes without the black box of big tech. Of course, there are tools also for Mac and Windows as well. So those are certainly options out there. So with that, you will have the options and the tools available with you in order to listen to your podcasts without tying yourself into big tech. Is this a little bit less convenient? Of course it is. But that's actually the trick of having a healthy modern life, because the more convenient these devices make our life, the more we give to them, the more we give up our autonomy, and the more we forget how to do basic things like manipulating files and managing all of the applications. These are those things to keep in mind. Sometimes the conveniences are worth it. More often than not, the conveniences actually interfere with our life as human beings. So hopefully this video was helpful for you. Let me know if you like this format. Should we do more heavily scripted, or at least outlined videos in the outdoors with some computer screens crammed in? Let me know if it was a great balance. This is something new I'm trying. Let me know your thoughts about this and the other things related to the topic in the comments down below. Thank you for watching this video from Switched to Linux. This channel would not be possible without the backing of the program supporters scrolling on the screen now. You can be a supporter at Patreon at patreon.com/TOMM or at thinklifemedia.com. I also want to thank the open source community who creates such excellent software that makes producing this show possible. Please remember to support your software communities. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.